From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
As Naomi mentioned, this is the second in a series of three talking about the Mesoamerican codices that are in the collections of the Library of Congress. The one we're going to be talking about today is one of the earliest ones to come into the library's collections, the Oztoticpac Lands Map. No one is really sure exactly when this particular map came into the library's collection. It has been theorized that it came into the collection as early as 1905, but it remained unknown pretty much until April of 1965, when it was pointed out by some of the map mounters, people mounting maps on backing here at the library. It was pointed out to one of the map curators, and that's where it kind of came into the scholarly orbit of map historians and Mesoamerican historians. So we don't really know very much about the actual history. When there was a big census being done for the Handbook of Middle American Indians, which was published by Tulane throughout the 60s and 70s, and a lot of the Mesoamerican codices were researched for that project. Those researchers also turned up absolutely no information about the document's history and its provenance. So we really are working with something that we don't know very much about as far as where it came from. It is, however, an extraordinary document, and we're going to get very deeply into it today. It is one of the most interesting maps from this period, certainly one of the most interesting indigenous maps that we could possibly sit here and talk about. Now, the map, of course, is Nahuatl. It's written in Nahuatl hieroglyphic writing with, of course, some Roman script, and we'll be talking a bit about that in just a bit. But just a little bit of thought on the language that we're going to be talking about here. Nahua is part of course, a larger group of languages, and it came into the Mesoamerican orbit and into Mexico, migrating down from the southwestern United States. It's part of a group of languages called the Uto-Aztecan languages, related to things like the North American Hopi language and some of the other Native American languages which are in the southwest. And it appears to have migrated down into the Valley of Mexico somewhere around 500 AD. Before that time, the Maya languages and a few of the other Mesoamerican languages had a much longer time period in the area. So there's a certain borrowing that took place, and many of the things that we see on this map and in the Nahua codices are regionalisms that are different across different areas of the Nahua-speaking region. Even today, there are about 28 different dialects of Nahua spoken throughout Mexico by about 1 million speakers. So it's an extremely interesting language group. And we're going to be spending a lot of time today looking at some of the first written forms, the first Romanized forms of Nahua that actually survive. So the Oztoticpac Lands Map was made really after the aftermath of a trial and execution of a local chieftain called Chichimecatecotl, and his name is Don Carlos, so he's given the Spanish noble Don, baptized, and he was executed in November of 1539. The reasons for that execution are kind of talked about a little bit on the map, and we'll talk a little bit about that in just a bit. But you can see the map is a large pictorial map. It is written and drawn on amatl or amatl, which is the mulberry or fig bark paper typical of indigenous Nahua and Aztecs. There's many codices that are on this kind of paper. The document itself has various areas associated with it. We can see there are these sort of sections of the map which kind of show different things, and we're going to go through this in some detail. We're going to talk a lot about these big sections of script that you see on the map below some of the maps here, because they're probably really give us a lot of insight into the history of the document and really into the history of what we're actually looking at when we look at the Oztoticpac Lands Map. So we're going to start up in that left-hand corner, and this area here, Tolonchinco, which is written right in the little box here, which is basically showing a parcel of land. The little clicks that you see on the sides here are the actual measurements of the land. If you sort of break this out, it measures 102 by 160 feet. One of the things that's very interesting on the Oztoticpac Lands Map is the parcels of land we're talking about are not very big. Even when we get to the palace of Don Carlos Chichimecatecotl, we are going to see that it's not that huge parcels of land that we see in some other Mesoamerican codices, like for instance the Quetzalcoatlin, which we talked about last time, maps and shows a much larger area than the Oztoticpac Lands Map. Now we can see here that there's a lot of script, and on the Oztoticpac there's really a couple of Spanish annotations which are kind of brief and short, and then there's a long glosses in Nahua. And this is one of the first times that Nahua is actually going to be written down in Roman script. What we're going to see as we get into the map is a little bit of the Nahua hieroglyphic writing. But what's important on this map beyond the hieroglyphics is these written pieces of script here, these Roman scripts. And really what we're looking at here is we're looking at throughout the map testimony given by the indigenous themselves. This one is given by one of the Texcocans on the map, Benito here. And basically what this piece of testimony talks about, it talks about really what the parcel of land and the history of it is. The text speaks about eyewitness encounters that the person who is speaking, not the person who is writing, person who is writing was most likely a cleric who wrote down this testimony on the map in Roman script. So this is phonetically sounded out testimony from this Texcocan Benito here. It talks about the history of the parcel of land, and it talks about an eyewitness encounter that he had with Don Carlos when there was a discussion about who owned this piece of land. And really what we're attempting to establish with this map, it is made for use in a Spanish court for a court case, which is a land dispute that will take place after the execution of Don Carlos in November of 1539. We can see on the figure itself, and this is going to be a central feature of the map, there are lots of little glyphs. In the center here we see these coca beans and basically the cacao here, basically the amount of cacao. And what we're seeing here is Don Carlos actually owns this piece of property, that this parcel, according to the testimony, is in fact a piece of private property. And it's really talking about the amount of tribute needed in order to rent and lease some of the properties. So the entire map is really going to get into a lot of detail about property law, how property is handled in Nahua and Aztec society, and it gives us a great deal of insight into the sort of bureaucratic superstructure of Nahua culture and how land was really treated. Now, one of the big features on the map is going to be this palace up on the up in the top corner, the left-hand corner. There is this large piece of land here, which really is the largest piece of property on the map itself, and it is a sort of palace complex with outbuildings, and we'll get into exactly how big this is. But there's a couple of glosses on the map which are in Nahua also. So the one on the top in the red box basically is telling us that this particular piece of property is not owned by Don Carlos, but in fact is owned by in common. And down below there's another one which says that it was owned by a man named Don Antonio, and we're not really sure exactly who some of the people on the map are, but we can identify some of them. The gloss itself says the palace at Oztoticpac belongs to the ruling line and not to Don Carlos. And so we have now two pieces of property. These are both on that left-hand section, one that does belong to Don Carlos and another one that in fact doesn't. One of the interesting things about that particular map is it exists really in two places. On the right-hand side is a section taken from the Oztoticpac Lands Map itself, and on the left-hand side is a fragment of a map found in the papers of Alexander Humboldt. This is called Alexander Humboldt Fragment 6, and that fragment, as you can see, is an exact mapping of the Oztoticpac Palace on the right-hand side. The people who are pictured on the Humboldt fragment are a lot of the people who are going to be involved in this land dispute, and they're actually shown on the Humboldt fragment, but they don't appear at all on the Oztoticpac Lands Map. So below that, below the palace, there is a large gloss, and that gloss is made by another indigenous testimonial, which basically talks about the property as being the Estates of Don Carlos being belonging to the entire family, and that this palace itself does not fully owned by Don Carlos. Now, really, what we have here when we start looking at this in detail and putting all of the testimonial together, we're really looking at an attempt by either Don Carlos's family or by some of his commoners and freeholders who are in his employ and renters to attempt to kind of grasp onto the land rights that they believe are theirs, both traditionally and under Spanish law. So really what we're looking at is we're looking at a pseudo-legal document that is really attempting to kind of show the history of a particular groups of parcels of land that Don Carlos is associated with. And so as we go through, there'll be this continual buildup of the various different kinds of properties that Don Carlos is associated with. And the map itself is really an amazing, amazing primary source for getting a handle on land ownership law, agricultural law, how rents and tributes were paid, the idea of rental properties, the idea of ownership, and the idea of hereditary ownership within Nahua and Aztec society. And it really does paint an extremely complex picture. And as all sort of mysterious primary source documents do, this particular document asks a lot more questions than it answers a lot of the time. Now, the biggest property that we see on the map is in fact this palace, and none of the properties are that big. This one is, as I said, 678 by 633 feet, which is not extremely large. And we can really tell how big the properties are because they're all surveyed. Every one of the properties that are shown on the map has these dots and bars around the perimeter, and each of those basically are giving us the length of the particular pieces of property. So it's not very difficult to reconstruct the actual sizes of the properties from the actual measurements themselves. The surveys are in the Nahua units, which are easily convertible to feet and standard units now. But this entire property is about 678 by 633 feet. So not a gigantic palace by any stretch of the imagination. So this is just a look at the inside of the palace itself with its little outbuildings and some of the actual way it's broken up. We're not really sure what any of the things inside here mean, but in both this and the Humboldt representation of the palace, the figures are exactly the same. And so gives us a little bit of insight into what the actual property and what the palace looked like. Now, one of the most interesting parts of the map is the right-hand top side, and this is an extremely complex layout of various properties again, and it's a complex mash of all different kinds of property plans kind of thrown together. And it tells us in one of the glosses that this is Oztoticpac, which means in Nahua above the road. And we can see on the bottom here the little feet in this road. So this is the road, and all these properties are above the road. We're not really sure exactly where this piece of property and where any of these are today. Nothing on the map can really be located precisely. There is an Oztoticpac that does exist today outside of Mexico City, but no one can really claim for sure where these particular pieces of property are. All we know is it's this complex of property plans and that we have this above the road. We have a Spanish gloss here, which basically tells us that all of these properties down here, these smaller plots, are basically for commoners. And so basically these are either rented or owned by the people in kind. There are 45 of them. The heads that we see on the right-hand side, there's a head with a flag, which is 20 plus 5. There are 45, and if you count the plots here, there are in fact 45 plots. And we also see here that there are these other smaller plots, these very linear plots, which a gloss here tells us are actually rented out, and that there are 10 of these, and here are the 10 heads basically associated with the 10 plots. And then here we have a whole bunch of tribute and numerical tribute, and what the calendrics of when tribute is to be paid, in other words, when rent is to be paid for the properties. Each of the plots themselves have a little glyph in them, which is in fact the name of either the owner or the piece of property itself. And so every one of these glyphs has its own little owner. Just to blow this up a little bit, here are some of the glyphs that we find in those plots, again with all of the measurements of each plot, and then the glyphs that name the actual plot itself. These are the tribute markers that have been put on the map, and one of the most interesting things that I find are the boundary markers. There's the boundary markers, which are even used today in some areas, are these agave plants, and we can see these agave plants like this. So how many agave plants are marking the boundaries? And even today, agave plants are used to mark field boundaries, and so we see that same thing. These are sort of difficult to pick up. You've really got to magnify the map a great deal to see these agave plants, but they're agave boundary markers. Now, one of the most fascinating parts of the map, and the thing that people are drawn to immediately when they look at it, are these place name glyphs on the left-hand side, and then these very stylized trees and bushes that exist on the map. And what we're actually looking at here, because the date of this map is 1539, no one's exactly sure when the map was made, but it had to be between late 1539 and sometime in 1540. So that is the time frame that we're really looking at for the construction of the map. And so what we see here is really the first botanical document from the New World that we know of. And what we actually see is we see the various places that are associated, Oztoticpac down here, and then we see these trees, and then numbers of trees. So we've got these inventories, the same way that we have the markers for the boundaries or for the lengths and distances of the various plots of land. We have tree inventories. And we've got a whole different group of trees. We've got apples, pears, pomegranates, and grapevines. And what we actually see is we actually see grafting. And I think this is kind of fascinating because these sorts of graftings are done even today. And we've got pears, pomegranates, and apples being grafted onto native rootstock. And we can actually, the same way a modern graft is done, you can see down on the left-hand side and on the right-hand side, these are two apple tree grafts. You can actually see the graft marks and the cuts where the grafting is actually done. So they're fairly realistic renditions of what these grafts would really look like. This is one of the grafts also, same exact thing. It's grafted here and grafted here. And this is really the grafting of grapevines onto native rootstock. And it's a kind of a fascinating botanical look at really what was actually happening on the ground during a very early period. We are really talking, only 20 years after the conquest. Cortez comes in 1519. We are just 1539. So we've already developed a lot of infrastructure, a lot of administrative ideas, and a lot of farming practices with old world things being grafted onto native rootstock. And so it's a kind of a fascinating little insight into the agricultural practices in this particular area of Mexico at the time. Now, the trees themselves are part of a contract that Don Carlos seems to have with a man named Pedro de Verga. And Pedro de Verga is in business with Don Carlos, and really what they're doing is they're growing exotic fruits that were popular and expensive in Europe, and they're either selling them to the local Spanish settlers or sending them back to Europe. No one really knows. The inventories that we have, we can actually count up the number of trees. And so, pear trees 67, quince trees 125, apples 103, the pomegranates and peaches we can't tell, and there are 27 grapevines. So it's not a small orchard when one thinks that one has between just quince and apples more than 200 trees of those two things. So again, some real insight into a bureaucracy and almost the business dealings that are been going on between the indigenous and the Spanish at this period. One of the most fascinating things about this document is this constant look into how both of these groups are interacting with one another, and how both the indigenous and the Spanish are sort of accommodating each other during this period. One of the things that you can think about when looking at this document, if this was to be argued in a Spanish court, and if these land rights are being claimed the way we believe they are in the document, what we're really seeing here is by 1539, 1540, at least part of the indigenous peoples in the Valley of Mexico, or around Oztoticpac and south of Mexico City, beginning to at least exercise some attempt at claiming rights in a Spanish court. And so if this is an attempt, if this document is, as many scholars believe it to be, a document that's used in a Spanish court to attempt to recover lands that were confiscated by the crown after the execution of Don Carlos, we really do see the beginnings of a certain accommodation, at least on the part of the indigenous peoples, or acceptance of Spanish law and working through Spanish law. Now, we talked about, those of you who were here and listened to the Codex Quetzalcoatlin piece, we talked a lot in that piece about sort of the ethnobotanical content of the manuscript. And again, here we are in a point where we are looking at a bit of ethnobotany. At least what we're looking at is we're looking at some agricultural practices. And so we're also getting a sense not only of sort of land ownership rights, but also of land use. How was land used during this period? What was important? And we can see in some of the commoner plots, the size of the plots are fairly small. But if one looks at other indigenous cultures that use agriculture in the same way, the plots are really about the same size. They're for the most part these subsistence plots that people are renting, who either work or in the employ of Don Carlos, or who live in the area as commoners. Many of the words that we see on the manuscript here that talk about agriculture appear in Nahua, and some of them are, of course, had to come later. So, in other words, they're later Nahua names. They're not Nahua names that predate the conquest. And this is just some of the things that we see associated with the map, and some of the botanical language associated with what was being grown. And for instance, the pears, the pomegranates, the quince, the grapes, and the apples, all of which appear on the map itself in their Nahua names. And so very much like we see the glyphs, which one can't really tell what the species of the plant are by looking at the glyph. This is very much the same as we saw on the Codex Quetzalcoatlin when we talked about the botanical structures, that we really did need the Nahua transcription into Roman letters, and really to understand what the plants actually are. One of the most fascinating parts of the map, and we'll conclude with this particular piece, is down on the right-hand side. And this little piece of text is both, it has a Spanish gloss on top and then a Nahua, longer Nahua gloss. And this particular piece of property is called Huehuechot. And the Huehuechot, lands of Huehuechot, the gloss says that Don Carlos, and it tells us that he died on the Feast of Mary Magdalene, so he was executed on the Feast of Mary Magdalene. And it also tells us that he provided well for his mistresses. It also gives us notes on some of the various affairs that he had, and these affairs and him having these mistresses were really used by the Inquisition against him. The question of why Don Carlos was executed, there is some talk about the fact that he did keep his, he gave this particular plot of land to his sister. His sister had inherited it. Shoshu is her name, and she had inherited it, and he then managed it, and then he gave it back to her. She had a daughter whose name is Inés Tonal, and Don Carlos kept her as a mistress and had two daughters with her. And several other places on the map, we get a sense that Don Carlos was a real player, and that he, at least according to the indigenous testimony, attempted to swindle people out of pieces of property, constantly had his ear to the ground to try and figure out which pieces of property were unoccupied, who owned them, who was dying, which pieces of property he could buy up. And really this, combined with the fact that he had kept his mistress, his niece's mistresses, and had two daughters out of wedlock, seems to have directed the attention of the Inquisition at him. He certainly was an important local person in this area, and he came from an important family whose noble line goes back quite a ways, even before the coming of the Spanish, before the contact period. And so really what we see in this map is we see, to a certain extent, we see the life of Don Carlos kind of played out after his death. We see that he was a local chieftain who attempted to or purchased pieces of land and rented them out. This seems to have been even before the contact or the coming of the Spanish. He had his niece as a mistress and had a couple of daughters by her. And so we see his life of an individual really played out on this map. And what we also see is we see the assertion of his heirs attempting to really assert their rights to this piece of property, and whether those rights are through hereditary, through the fact that they are inherited, or whether the fact that the confiscation of particular parts of these properties, which Don Carlos did not own, which were held in common, were illegal, and they needed to be returned. So it is a critically important primary source document, really one of the most important maps in the collections of the Library of Congress, and a critical primary source for anyone who's interested in both post-conquest sort of use of Spanish law by indigenous peoples, and really by the way later Nahua, pre-conquest Nahua, dealt with land and rented out properties and rural farmers and things like that. So a critical piece of primary history. Thank you all very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.